So now I'm out talking to VCs and I'm telling them my little piece of story that I have, right? They're asking me questions that I can't answer or questions that I haven't thought about the answers to. They're starting to, dig in a little bit. And that's when I learned that I didn't know enough and I needed to pull back from that experience, because if I approach one person and I can't answer it, that's just one person. But now when I approach two people and they ask me the same question, then I go, I really need to learn and understand that.
This is Funded, a show where founders who raised millions in venture capital share the gritty side of what it actually took to get that money in the bank. I'm Jason Ye. Not too long ago, I was trying to get my ideas funded. And back in the day, I was a VC listening to founders pitch me for money. Anyone who's raised capital before knows that fundraising can feel like stepping onto a tightrope. You've got this grand vision for scaling your company that needs capital to pull off, but you're balancing on a line that can sway with every conversation, with every investor that you try to close. One moment, you're full of confidence, taking steps forward, and the next, you're wobbling and questioning whether or not you can pull it off. It's a harrowing process where you can't look down or otherwise risk having the fear of falling consume you. Today's guest knows that tightrope well. After bootstrapping her company for months, Teasha Cable, founder and CEO of CModel, decided it was time to raise. But early on, the rejections came in hard. Instead of giving up or getting offended, she learned from each rejection, tweaked her approach, and started executing on what investors wanted to see. After a lot of trial and error, she locked down a lead investor in the Alabama Futures Fund, eventually closing a $1 million seed round in a not-so-easy market. And that description sounds easier than it actually was. After the Alabama Futures Fund committed, it still took 6 months of grinding to fully close her seed round. That persistence, though, wasn't something new for her. You'll hear more on why that is as we rewind the clock back and zoom in on Teasha's childhood and the birthplace of jazz.
Yeah. So for me, childhood it was fun. I grew up in New Orleans, in a city where my family made up a square block. At one point, my grandmother lived downstairs from us, and then we moved, and you could walk a whole square block and be surrounded by a bunch of people who were my cousins and aunts and uncles, and back a couple generations, right? So it was a pretty interesting dynamic in our neighborhood. We were poor, but it didn't feel like it. We didn't know it. My family, a family full of educators and folks like that. Matter of fact, they tell the story often about having come from being sharecroppers, and one of the first things they did was build a schoolhouse. So education was a big part of the dynamic within our family. So it was that I had I would say normal childhood in that way, as anyone would growing up in the South.
Yeah.
But then something happened. So round about the time that I was in high school, my mom married my dad, my stepfather, and we moved to California.
Whoa.
And
Culture shock.
yes, big culture shock. It was something. And in that experience, it was really the first time I had experienced a lot of things outside of Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about that from my perspective, but even from my mom, like, it was a lot. It was her first time experiencing a lot of things for the first time. And she was in her 40s. And so for me, it was, I got a chance to start doing different things like theater. I got a chance to, I was in diverse schools, which I hadn't experienced before that. So there were a lot of things that were very different in my experience moving to California, not to mention it's California.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that
Tell me
happened.
a bit about it. Sounds like you grew up in a fairly tight family unit, extended family around you, and then moving to California with all this culture shift. Some of that movement can impact children in different ways, maybe put them in their shells, sometimes allowing them an opportunity to reinvent themselves. Were you extroverted, introverted? Tell us a little bit about that.
I am extroverted, always have been. But what's interesting about that particular point is I did reinvent myself when we moved. And one of the things that was missing for me was in that close knit piece, all of my friends were my cousins. Right. So I grew up with my first cousins as like my best friends. And moving out, I did have to reinvent myself because now I had to go outside of my pocket in order to like build relationships with people. So my extroversion was a thing, but maybe sometimes I was a little bit, maybe it was more,
Yeah.
right? Because I knew that I needed to, uh, I needed to bring people in to my world who didn't
Sure.
already naturally just love everything about me because they weren't my family, right? So it was a big transition making that shift. But I will say what I did get out of it, because I was exposed to people who had grew up differently than I did, was I did make friends along the way, and I did have experiences that I know that New Orleans didn't have to offer me.
Hmm. So, I mean, you're talking a little bit about some skill sets that you built early on that I think would be applied for some of the later stories that we'll get into. This idea of making sure that you had to go out and talk to people and actually convince them there's a reason for you to for them to like you, other than the fact that you share blood, right? Um, what about your inspirations in terms of career and where you thought you were going to go? Right, a family of educators, but at some point you guys moved to California. Especially when you got to California, where did you think your life would go? You were in theater, but what were the things that you thought you might get into later down the road?
I really didn't know, but I did somehow think I'd end up teaching. I thought that teaching was going to be a thing. At some point, I thought acting maybe was going to be a thing. That wasn't. I think I was driven more by like being in front and like telling people what to do. So,
You could call it leadership. You don't have to say that.
exactly.
Uh,
So I I spent quite a bit thinking that it was going to be one of those things. I never thought that I'd end up on the path that I'm going. Something else. I mean, we'll get to this place in my life, but my career actually developed later in my education. A lot of things changed post college. Tell me when we're ready to tell that part of the story.
yeah, no, I would love to jump into that. So it feels like we have a good baseline for how you grew up and sort of your personality evolving. Would love to transition to your jump into startups, and we will quickly go into thinking about how you ran a fundraise for this company, but maybe we spend a few minutes just connecting the dots between uh, outgoing Teasha in California to now outgoing founder and CEO of CModel. There's some yada 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 in between that we should probably cover. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and it's actually really significant because something that happened. So I went off to college. I was 17 when I went off to college, but and I went back to New Orleans, came back to California where my parents were, and I ended up pregnant. I ended up having my first daughter pretty early, so I ended up leaving school. And so what that brought me to was like real life, right? So now I have a kid. I ended up married shortly after. Then I had another kid. Then I'm like, wait a minute, I'm finding myself in this sort of revolving door in my career. I got to go back to school. And
Oh,
so I did that, and I did that while I was working at the University of California, matter of fact.
cool.
So I didn't go to the University of California, but I was working there, and then I was like, hey, okay, let's go back to school. So once I did that, then I found my career in operations. And I found my career in sales operations, where I walked into the office and they said, here's your desk, here's your computer, what's the forecast? And I'm like, I can do that. And they said, oh, and we just bought this tool called Salesforce.com. Can you use that? And I'm like, I sure can. And I really couldn't, but I was going to figure it out. And so I think I got busy utilizing my new learning from studying business, and brought that to the table in solving problems for companies. And it was that journey of solving problems over the course of about 25 years that led me to foundership. So I've been everything from a VP of business operations, a VP of business development and product strategy, and a VP of revenue operations. So these are all the roles that I had along my trajectory to determining that I was going to start C Model. I
Yeah.
also went out and consulted in a lot of companies. Mhm.
No. So really
Yeah.
impressive career, but I think only founders like you understand how big the gap is between being a successful executive to then actually like making the leap to right to being a founder. And there are a lot of things to mention there. Obviously, like giving up a predictable revenue stream, predictable salary, something comfortable, into doing something that's very uncertain is not, you can say that. And then I started the company, but look, you have a family to support, you have a lot of things going on. Tell us a little bit about what pulled you into the journey. And in particular, maybe you can connect it to the thing that we focus on, which is fundraising. When you
Yeah.
knew that you wanted to start a company, talk a little bit about that, but also mention, did you know it was going to be something that you had to raise capital for?
Mm. So when I decided, so I was consulting in
Mm,
companies and helping them to, forecast. I was working in these companies, and I was like, well, I can't really scale a consultancy, not to solve as many people as I want, if I ever want to not work, because I was doing both.
mm,
And so when my husband, we had a conversation, I'm like, hey, I think I'm ready. I think I want to do this thing. And he's like, okay, well, let's do it. I still thought I'd, maintain some of the consulting work at the same time, but I quickly realized that to build the kind of venture that I wanted to build, that wasn't going to be
mm,
possible, that I had to wholly focus the company on solving the problem that we set out to solve. And it took me a long time to determine, is this an exponential growth company or a sustainable growth company, right? Because
mm,
the consulting model is like slow and steady wins the race, right? But I was quickly learning that the reason why companies choose to raise venture capital is because they have this heavy stuff to build right on the front end, right? I need to go fast now in order for it to be greater later. And so when I started digging into, how we were going to build the tech, how we were going to, what we needed to do in order to even just get past the prototype stage, I was like, ugh, we are going to have to raise money. We bootstrapped until so we started the company in 2022 and we bootstrapped until that May. So I used up all my savings, right? We did a lot to sort of get started, and I tried for as long as possible until I understood what it would take to actually close around the funding. And I had a few starts. Like I would go out and be like, oh, I'm raising so
mm.
many millions of dollars, right? And then quickly found I didn't have any of the things that I needed in order to do that. And I didn't understand the mindset of the VC. And I didn't understand the structure and formula by which that piece of sort of system operates and what the company needs to look like. I didn't know what they were looking for,
Yeah.
right? I'm thinking, hey, you just will like me and my great idea. And I'm certain that that works for some people, right? But it's not like the reality for the grand sort of
Well,
uh,
Tisha,
for the most yeah.
let's pause right there because I don't want to like glaze over this. This is a rite of passage. The thing that you're describing is a rite of passage for a lot of founders, and I think in that journey of learning that on the fly, a lot of founders don't make it to what you were able to get through, right? Because they try these things that don't work, and then it's done, right? So tell me a little bit about the first tries, or like you were like, I think I want to try this, and then you said you needed to learn. Was it trial and error learning? Was it you went out and found people? Like, I want to understand. I want people to understand how you did it, so that maybe
Yeah.
they can reduce some of the steps that they take themselves in order to find the right path.
You know what happened was, I got out of theory and got into execution mode, and that made a
Mm,
difference, and here's what I mean. You start talking to people, right? So when you are thinking about theorizing around fundraising or anything, even building the company, when you're
yeah,
theorizing about it, it's going to be easy. You're just gonna do this, and if you do all the right things, everything will work out, it'll be great. But when you get into executing, that's when you start learning. So now I'm out talking to VCs and I'm telling them my little piece of story that I have, right? They're asking me questions that I can't answer or questions that I haven't thought about the answers to. They're starting to, dig in a little bit. And that's when I learned that I didn't know enough and I needed to pull back from that experience because If I approach one person and I can't answer, that's just one person. And I go write it down and go, oh, but now when I approach two people and they ask me the same question, then I go, I really need to learn and understand that. Let me give you a perfect example. So at this early stage of company, in most cases, you're told, you don't have to, you need to understand your customer, who that is. Therefore, how do you do that though, right? You need to do a whole lot of customer discovery. No one says go do customer discovery. They do say, oh, so tell me about your customer. Tell me about this. Tell me about that, right? They don't tell you that you need to have your go-to-market strategy laid out and crystal clear, that you just start getting asked questions about, how, where are these people going to come from and how are you going to do that? And so in as much as on one side, you have all of the fantasy of startup land, oh, do unscalable things and just live your best life. The flip
Right.
side of that is no. You need to be able to prove things. You need to have information to support the things that you say. You need to know what you're going to do in order to achieve these outcomes that you're laying out. And I think that the language often gets mixed for founders, right? It's like you're free to do whatever. No, you're building a company that needs to look how companies look, right? But you need to have a great idea right now, right? And you need to know that there's a market to go out and sell that thing to. But you also need to know how you're going to do it. At least have fundamental assumptions that you can take into the room and share with others confidently,
Yeah.
and have some backup for. Yeah.
No,
That was
that's super helpful to hear that laid out. And there's this portion of building a startup, a venture-backed startup, that a lot of founders, like you said, kind of glaze over. And in certain ways, a younger Teasha, like a couple years ago, might have, I think, kind of did this same thing where you had the idea, and then you're like, let's just go raise money because investors invest in companies, right? Um, and I think this sounds overly simple, but people glaze over it, is that you need to be building a good company, right? You need to be building a company that fits what investors are looking for, which might sound simple, but it is a company solving a real problem that customers want to buy from, that has an opportunity to scale. And in particular for venture capitalists, has the potential of being massive. And I just think that founders don't sharpen their pencils enough to be like, "Well, I might not have that yet, but I need to show that that's what I'm building." Right. And so how do you do that? How do you communicate that? What can you show at the earliest stages?
that's great.
So it's cool that you quickly were like, oh, instead of like playing founder, I gotta be a founder, right? And
That's
go
great.
do this.
But I got to
Well, that's great.
founder. No. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Can
No,
I
no,
just say
please.
this, which is I have to be a founder, but from me, where I had come from, I'm not going to be a business leader, because there was a significant difference between me coming in and thinking I know how to do this because I've run a million companies, right?
Right.
Versus no, I am starting something new at the floor and I know
Yeah.
nothing about doing this. That was one of the
Well,
biggest shifts.
so I would normally jump into some other parts, but there's something that I want to have a discussion with you around, specifically because of your background. So you had a really long career in sales operations, right? You understand the motion of B2B sales, of software sales. And a lot of people are quick to point out that fundraising looks a lot like sales, right? And whenever I talk to founders and I'm helping them through that, I do let them know that fundraising and sales are close cousins, but they are different. And, the fact that you had such a deep background in sales and had a bit of a false start, or like had to update your own mental models,
Mhm.
means that there is a gap. I wonder if you've ever reflected on that, and if we could do that live, like knowing what you know now, but about those two things, what are some of the things that you would point out that are like, oh, this is what I thought based on sales. This was maybe different. Here's what I had to update. Any thoughts there?
Yeah. So number one, how you talk about what it is that you're building. So in fundraising, you start at the vision. And it's from the vision that you start to develop. Then there is a market, right? And there is a a mission, right, that we're going to go on, and here's how we're going to do it in very sort of descriptive, product heavy, technology, moat ish, what's special, what's unique about me, what's awesome, right? When you are selling, you're focused on the customer and their pain. What are you feeling? What do you need? What are the problems you are solving? And it is a different conversation. I actually was having a much easier time in the beginning having customer conversations. Like, we did a lot of customer discovery. I sat on call with, at this point, the multiples of hundreds of CEOs and CFOs of companies, and to talk about this problem. And that's easier in some ways, right? Because either they feel it or they don't feel it. Whereas when you get into the fundraising game, I'm talking about my vision, this thing that I have to solve that problem for that customer.
Yeah.
And I need you to believe in me. I need you to feel it and understand it and be excited about it, venture capitalist, in the same way that I am. I need you to believe in me, that I am the one that can deliver on this vision to the world. That is a little bit different than the sales customer conversation, which is just a bit more concrete, right? Customer feels it, they're experiencing it, or they're not. It's a little more subjective, right? At
Yeah.
the investor level. Yeah.
No, there is this nuance that doesn't quite exist in a clear, like, oh, we need a way to track our marketing leads. And do you track marketing leads better? Right.
Actually,
The one thing that I've grown to understand is fundraising is a lot like sales, and similar to when you're selling, B2B software or anything else. What's really important is that you get in the mind of the buyer, right? You understand how someone makes a buying decision for software so that you can fit into that model. I think the big key differentiator is, so it is the same, but the mind of the buyer is really nuanced and subjective, and like not based on hard facts all the time with an investor. And I think that is one of the biggest gaps. And it's kind of what you talk about. It's because, like, wow, I didn't realize this, but what they are looking for is
that's right.
vision. And what they are looking for is an inspiring figure that they want to back, because they think that person, that founder, might be able to do a bunch of things.
Well,
No, that's
with a great, yeah, with
no,
a
go
great
ahead.
idea behind it. Yeah. Back to your point earlier, with a great idea. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Okay,
Mhm.
so at some point you cross the chasm of understanding, oh, well, this is what the motion needs to be. This is what it needs to look more like, and actually probably need to do some more work within my company before I fundraise. But at some point you kind of feel the green light in yourself, and you have a better understanding of what you need to do. What was that for you? Like, and what did you start? Was that part of the $1 million round that you raised? At least that's what's
Yeah.
announced. I love Teasha's emphasis on understanding the mind of the investor. I think a lot of founders jump into raising from VCs with a cool idea and a big dream and forget that they're entering into a whole new game with a whole new set of rules, one they rarely understand well enough before setting out to raise. When we come back, we get to hear about how Teasha navigated the fundraising process and ultimately closed her round. There are a ton of easy to make mistakes when growing a startup. I feel like I've either made them all myself or seen them all as an advisor and investor. One super common one is waiting too long to bring in expert help around managing company finances. I get why that happens though. You're not a tiny company anymore, but you feel like you're not big enough to have an in-house finance team and don't want to waste money. My advice to you is to avoid the mistake of just winging it. This is not a time to fake it till you make it. At least talk to someone early so that you can hear about how the additional help could actually save you money and improve your operations. If you're looking for recommendations on who to talk to, check out Propeller Industries. They've worked with hundreds of venture to growth stage startups, so have a ton of deep knowledge to help you avoid major bumps and set your company up for success, whether it's talking to investors or planning for future growth. Set up a free call by going to fundedpod.com/propeller. That's PROPELLER, and tell them we sent you. They're giving Funded listeners a one-time $2,500 new client credit if you work with them for 3 months.
Yes. So
Okay.
so what happened was the first thing was we did the AWS Impact Accelerator first, and that was our first
Hmm.
sort of intro into the process, and decided not to really go too hard on the fundraising right after that because we had a lot of things to build. But fast forward to May of 2023, we got into Techstars. And at the Techstars
Mm.
level of accelerator, now we're talking about we've got a bunch more laid out. We're much more clear. And that program in itself was far more geared towards the stage we were at. We were exiting existence into survival. And, we got a product, we got customers, we got a little revenue. Now we're just trying to find our footing with capital and customers. What does that look like? Techstars. And coming out of Techstars, what it did was just there was a narrative development that got really crystal clear while we were there. That was number one. What are we doing? And then really the main thing, and I tell people this all the time, is, and then what does the world look like when we fulfill our purpose? We
Mm.
had an ED ask us that, and it was the best question. So now I ask everybody, because if I understand my purpose and I understand what the world looks like when I fulfill it, then my story becomes clearer. And that's the story that I can then translate to investors, because that is the other critical part of what happens in that investment process, which is communicating the story if you don't have all the backings in the company. This is why traction and all of these things can take on different forms depending upon how big and broad your market is, and so on, right? And so, or how big your idea is, how special the technology is. The narrative starts to support all of the other pieces and parts. And so for me, once I got that clear, then I was ready to go and talk to more venture capitalists. And I took a path of warm intros as an easier way in some of the doors. So as opposed to just all the cold outreach, it was I meet
Yep.
somebody and then ask for the introduction to the next person. And I'll get you that fundraising is hard. One of the hardest things, and I still have a lot more to do, by the way, right? One of the hardest things that I think there is to do is to have somebody tell you that your baby is ugly, right? I don't like your baby. You know, your baby is cute, but it's not special.
Sure. Right.
So those things are
And
very
over
difficult
and over again, right?
over and over again, right? But then if you look at it by the numbers, then you go, this makes a lot of sense. And if you also dig into the thesis of any particular investment firm, I went back, I did an exercise, I looked at all the no's. And most of the no's that I got were from people who don't either they didn't understand the technology that we were building, uh, thought it was too far on the edge at the time, didn't understand that space, or they don't invest in companies like mine, or maybe that they didn't say it in their words, but our stage, we were too early for them.
Mm.
So qualifying those no's into like who these folks were that said no, and then looking back at them, then I go, oh, that's the other thing you're supposed to do, is be very specific and narrow in who you're going to talk to so that you don't end up in that situation. Right? Although every VC conversation to me is a good one, because you learn something, right? If you find that it's not a fit, there's some questions to ask, right? There's some things to
Yeah.
learn to understand the mindset, right? Which in some cases is really traditional, right? They have a very specific way, like don't change up that pitch deck. Right. A problem is a problem. A solution is a solution. Don't get too fancy with your storytelling. Right. Like that's a very
Right.
traditional thing. And you got to learn that, because otherwise you're going to be at no before you know it. And then the other thing is learning what the no's are. Like I didn't know about the valuation questions and how to answer those. Right.
Mm.
I didn't know, or how to not answer them. I didn't know about some of the go to market questions, how those are supposed to be answered. So I didn't know they were looking for a way to say no, or they are not were, but they are always looking for how to say no,
Yep.
because 1% of all the companies that get started are ever going to receive $1
Yep.
from VC,
Yep.
right? So of course they're looking for, oh, that's a no, not in on that one. Call me later. That's how it kind of goes.
Yeah. No, Teasha, this is super helpful for people to hear. And you're kind of illustrating why repeat founders do a lot better too, because they've seen this, right? They learned it. And It is one of the reasons why, like, I am a huge supporter of people finding Sherpas, going through mentorship programs, joining accelerators if you don't have the background experience and network to actually try to get this done. It is really hard when you don't know what you're doing and you make it up as you go along and you try to fake it until you make it. The chances of you getting that right are quite slim. And people don't realize that, like, they look at you and maybe they fantasize in their head of like this working woman that just like landed and figured it out. Like you might have been able to do it, but like really glad
It's
that
been
you actually took steps to get some support, right?
100%. And other founders, like I said, I talked to a lot of people. There's been a lot of phone calls with founders who have successfully raised, just to see like what happened there and exited too. Like, so talking to founders who have both raised and founders who have gotten out. And both are good conversations to think about, what does that part of the strategy look like? Oh, because guess what? You will be asked that question. Right. So you need to understand what your perspective is on that. You can't just make one up though. It has to be something
Yeah.
that can become real. So you can't talk about an exit without understanding what that landscape actually looks like. But those are the things that it takes accelerators and some of these other programs to help to bring you to that point. So that I think there's like a place for all of these sort of levels of growing up into a startup. I love your point
Mm.
about multi-type founders, because only 4% of founders have ever run a business before. We start a company, right? So only 4% look like me, where you've done work and they're responsible for some other company's growth or anything like that. Most are engineers who come from certain levels of engineering, right? Um, or they've been specialists in a particular place. So getting a large sort of area of education in your mindset as you run the program is run a company is very, very, very key, because there is no way for you to know what you're going to run up against until you run up against it. So continually educating yourself and learning from others and picking up books. There's a reason why there's so many startup books, especially as you go into accelerators and programs like that
There's so
too.
much to learn.
Um, yeah, you need to learn. It's a continuous, because otherwise you're going to learn the hard way too. Right. So, and that's okay. Some of us, it's constantly learning the hard way, but you
Yeah.
can mitigate some of the risk, right, by continually focusing yourself on education, especially around fundraising, because it is a book,
Yeah.
it is a thing that happens a very specific way, the process.
Awesome. You're
Well,
it's
yeah,
music to my ears 'cause this is
yeah.
exactly, my philosophy. Um, let's get into actually what happened. So you exited Techstars in kind of early-ish, maybe early to mid 2023. And then did you immediately start fundraising for the full million afterwards? Tell us a little bit, like high level, when did you start and how long did it take you? Because by the way,
Yeah.
this is not a good market to be fundraising.
No, it's not. And we're about to hop back in. So what happened was, while we were in the program, we kind of started getting things organized and laying out, utilizing the resources from the program. Right. So that
Yeah.
this is what Stars does. Right. And so we full well took advantage of, like, what is the networking that needs to happen? What do our lists look like? What do we need to do to keep it moving? But while I was in the program, I got a fantastic phone call from Birmingham, Alabama. And it was
Hmm.
from Red Hawk Advisory, which is the Alabama Futures Fund. And they found me. And they found me, took interest, and reached out while I was in program. And so we started our conversations during that time, and they call and follow up and check to see what our progress was that we were making and how it was going. And when we got out of the program, so fast forward 3 months, we got out of the program. That's when it was probably about a couple of weeks after we ended up getting our first term sheet from Alabama Futures Fund.
Wow.
And then 3 months later, I want to say, yeah, so a total of 6 months it took us to close the round, but the rest was in the following few months. Now, and I think we went through, if we only include that focus 6 months, it took us of some very focused conversations, a total of about 30 some odd VCs that we talked to. Now, I talked to lots more than that before that.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, but in the
Well,
focus.
Teasha, I'll just say, actually, I hope you know how, like, you, I mean, it's pretty unique to have had this lead investor kind of reach out to you. You're like just kicking off the process, and man, that is amazing. And I think one of the things to call out is just to illustrate, especially back in, call it, mid 2023, just how bad the market was then. I think it's getting better now, but back then, even with a lead term sheet in place, it took you another, 4-ish months of continuous conversation with a lead in place to fill out a round. That is not how it used to be. It used to be the lead was a domino that just kind of like, knocked
That's what
everyone down.
I thought that would happen, and it didn't. It was harder, harder than that. The thing about our lead, the thing that's special is that, and how that happened is it goes back to like their thesis supported them funding us. They understood our business. It just wasn't a stressful scenario, right? They understood our business. They understood the space we were going in. They understood the vision as I communicated it. And because those things aligned properly, it led us to, closing up that part of the deal. And then I will say the
Right.
same for my follow-up is the next, well, not for my next investor, right? Is again, they understood mission, they understood the vision, they understand the space we're in. And so it just made the conversations very different than what it was with the investors who had less of an understanding and some of the no's, right? So
Yeah.
for me, the key thing was my yeses, they were supportive. There was nothing adversarial in the conversations. They were immediately supportive. They were immediately like when I say immediately, meaning they went through their due diligence, right? Very strict diligence with both. And then, but there was an understanding that existed. And I find with the no,
Right.
sometimes that it wasn't, and they don't always communicate.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you had some great things happen along the way, obviously. Alabama Futures Fund reaching out, and all this wrapping up in a really hard market. But you did use the word like difficult, right? And like as you were talking about these, as you were saying these words, like I can like look behind your eyes and see that there was some challenging times. Um, do any interactions or stories come to mind of some of the harder times during fundraising? Anything that you'd be willing to
Yeah.
share?
Well, every no hurts a different way. Um, Especially, funny enough, they hurt a different way, especially after you've gotten a yes. Like, it's really hard to get a no after 2 yeses. So after Alabama Futures Fund and Rogue Women's Fund, getting a no after that is like, what are you talking about? Right. But right, it's like you're crazy. But if it, I will say every no cuts differently, but the ones where they told me something like, oh, well, I don't know how you're different than this or this, that those were the ones that cut me because I felt like they clearly hadn't heard anything that I said. And so
Right.
those were painful. The other ones that are painful is when they take you through a process over a long period of time and string you and
Mhm.
it's stringy and it looks like it's happening and then it doesn't. Those are painful. I much prefer the quick no's, like cut me off, cut me loose, and let's go. So I think that I know sometimes different dynamics happen for people to make decisions, but when people are convicted, and I understand that to be the case for VCs, when they have conviction, they typically emotionally respond to that conviction, and there isn't a stringing you along. It's like, got it, or I don't.
Yeah.
Right. And so I much prefer got it or I don't versus I like it, I like it, I like it. Let's
Yeah.
keep
And
talking.
then
And
not.
then no, that hurts. Yeah.
So I don't want to like leave us kind of wallowing in the negative parts of the fundraise. At
Yeah.
some point, at some point, there was something that made you realize, like, oh, this is going to happen, right? Like, my guess is that Alabama Futures Fund didn't fund right away. They were like, you gotta get to a certain point, and then we'll close together. Is that right?
You said get to a certain point. Say it again.
Yeah. So Alabama Futures Fund signs a term sheet, gives you the term sheet. They don't fund immediate. They don't put their check in immediately. They say we will fund when you filled it out or something like that. So even though you had the term sheet, after a while, you're like, "Whoa, it's not done yet," right?
Well, it with Alabama Futures Fund, so Techstars also gave us a term sheet, and theirs was that way,
Yeah.
right? Where we needed to
Mhm.
fill it out, print them out for them. But with Alabama Futures Fund, it was a matter of passing through the diligence process, and then they fund. And then we were already funded when we got Rogue Women's, and those were our three. So it
Huh.
wasn't they didn't make us fill it out the entire thing. But their diligence process was extremely um, rigid, and so because of that, it just took a while to go through and have that finalized. But that was essentially it.
What did
Yeah,
it feel
I,
like? Do you remember when you got the term sheet, or like when you had that first realization, like, oh my gosh, like somebody wants to lead $1 million round. Do you remember where you were and what that feeling was?
I do remember. So I was in my home office in California actually because I had gotten back, and because we did Techstars in Tulsa, and so when I got back to California, when we got the call, I shed a lot of tears, and I shed a lot of tears for a lot of reasons. Number one, I know that, and I know earlier you talked about, anybody can be funded, but the numbers say things like this. We talked about that 1% of any company, and then 1% of that 1% are Black, and 0.2% of that 1% are Black and female, meaning there have only been a little over 200 at this point Black women who've ever raised more than $1 million ever in life anywhere. And so for me, there was a lot of like, wow, at least at a minimum, I hit this milestone. I get it in the grand scheme of fundraising, it's just $1 million, right? But in the grand scheme of my company, being able to live longer and someone believing in the vision that I set forth on the table and valuing the work that I've done to this point to deliver on that was inspirational to me. So the combination of those things, I cried like a baby and then called everybody up, and I was very, very excited about it. I didn't want to tell too much of a story around because it's like, well, what am I going to, let me make sure I have a good plan on what we're going to do next, right? Let me show some
Right.
milestones. They go, we raised some money. So it had been a hard 6 months, right? Like I didn't know that we were going to get more than the first check at one point, right? So it was quite a journey. So it took a little, whew, but then I realized, well, heck, now I got this money, I got to go do some stuff.
Right.
And
Now
then
now the
I'm
works.
done, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
That's
like $1 million
right.
building an exponential company is like a drop in the bucket.
Totally. Neither of us was trying to drive the conversation in this direction. Really wanted to focus on you at your core, your founder story, what it took to fundraise. But I'm glad we did bring this up because it's an important topic. And the thing that I mention whenever these conversations happen is like the reality is, and I speak to a lot of venture capitalists about understanding the inequity and how capital gets allocated. And for the most part, I know it's hard to hear this from a lot of founders. But for the most part, the people that I meet who are venture capitalists, and I used to be one, are good people. And they aren't
Mhm.
trying to do a certain thing, right? But I will say is they have a really dumb set of tools at their disposal when they are trying to make decisions around investing. They're blunt objects. They're not scalpels. Like they're not sniper rifles of being able to like, cut exactly what they need to do. They're blunt object dumb tools like pattern matching, right? They're like, hmm, have I ever seen seen something like this before? And they mean that in the business model sense, and they mean that in the founder sense, right? And that approach creates a lot of um, false negatives, right? Because they don't know because they've never seen it. You laid out the numbers in broad strokes. It is a percent of a percent look like you, right? Which means that you didn't bring it up. You didn't bring it up during our conversation of the difficulty of the raise, which I deeply respect, even though you could, right? Um, but the reality is your path is harder, right? Because the pattern matching is non-existent and you need to show people other things. But the thing that I'm excited about for you and like the tears that you shed, really, I mean, it's you don't get a chance to have a Teasha to model against. Like you don't get to have investors say, this person reminds me of Teasha.
Wow.
But a lot of the work that you're doing right now creates a pattern for others to match against, which we hope will make a real impact. So
I like,
I think I think we'll leave the conversation, kind of try to wrap it up there.
yeah.
A couple other things maybe that'll be fun to pick out. You get a chance, I'm sure, to speak to a lot of founders now. You pay it forward, right? You were talking about calling other people, and now you're somebody that people call, I'm sure. Um, what are your favorite pieces of advice to give new founders, especially within fundraising? But if you have a favorite one that's outside of fundraising, I think that's worth sharing as well.
Yeah. For everything, fundraising, for building the company, being clear about your purpose. Why are you doing what you're doing? And hold tight to that purpose. No one tells you to invest in your vision statement right up front, but you should. Being clear about does the world look like when your purpose is fulfilled? Because that unique value is something that gets added to your narrative. It also holds you firm when things get rough. When it gets hard, and you can come back and go, I have a purpose, right? That cannot be shifted or changed by what a VC says. It can't be shifted or changed even by one customer no, right? And there's a vision of the world that I'm seeking to fulfill. That is what I'm trying to do. That is why I do what I do. That'll get you up every day more than it will to talk to investors, right? So get up for that and then keep that in mind when you're having those conversations because the going will get tough. But remembering it and staying attuned to your purpose is ultimately the most important thing that I often share. And I don't think that we get told to review that enough.
Yeah,
Yeah.
super helpful. Other quick question. We like asking founders who have their ear to the ground and meet a lot of other founders, like who are a couple founders in your community who are like maybe a couple steps behind you that we should be keeping our eyes and ears open for? We've been lucky enough to do 4 seasons of Funded now over nearly 3 years. And we've gotten to the cycle where people early in our episodes that we were like, hey, by the way, who are the people that are coming up are now actually it's happening. And then we've been able to interview the people from that were recommended 2 years ago because they did end up raising big rounds. Any names come to mind for you? Names of people or companies?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple. So comes to mind for me. They're a company. I know they're in a TechStars program right now. I talked to them just today. It was a great conversation. Prep Intel is another company. Guy's name is Jay Johnson, who runs that company. Smart Tracker. I wouldn't even. They're not even behind us. I would say they haven't. They're just starting to raise capital, but they have a successful company. So I see them coming along to have this conversation with. Probably soon. Myri Health. I mean, I'm in so many communities of startups that I think a number of them are going to hit their fundraising pace pretty soon. That just hit me up and I'll just start sending you a list of people if you're just looking for folks to contact. Got a whole list of them. Yeah. With good
Awesome.
ideas, great companies solving real problems in the world. So I'm very excited to see what happens from those companies.
Awesome. That was my episode with Teasha Cable, founder and CEO of CModel, driving companies to the next level of growth. It's stories like Teasha's that I believe move the needle and can change entire patterns in the industry. I hope her story inspires you to go after what you're passionate about, even when the path feels uncertain. When we come back, we'll see what questions my producer Paige is bringing to the table. Like many of you, my last venture-backed startup was a SaaS business. In that company early on, we had the opportunity to sell into a large enterprise, but ran into some walls when they asked us if we were SOC 2 certified. Not only were we not certified, we also found out that it would take our small team a ton of time to get that done, and so we ended up abandoning the deal. If you haven't run into a situation like that where a potential customer or investor is asking if you're SOC 2, HIPAA, GDPR, or ISO 27001 certified, you probably will soon. But unlike me, you could use a company called Vanta to help. Vanta helps automate up to 90% of the compliance work, getting you audit ready in weeks rather than months, and eliminating up to 85% of the costs. Not only that, but Vanta can start small with you and scale up as you grow, helping you land bigger deals and earn customer trust. The best part is, Vanta is offering funded listeners $1,000 off for going to vanta.com/funded. That's VANTA.com/funded for $1,000 off your service. Check it out.
Hello, Jason.
Hey, P, how's it going?
Very well, very well. How about yourself?
Good, good. It's weather is turning a little bit cooler here in Los Angeles, but it's still nice. I mean, obviously, we still get 360 days of nice weather down in
Oh,
Southern
yeah.
California.
I know. I'm sure it's like it feels crazy when you have a cloudy day. You're like, what's going on?
Yeah, it is a little bit like, what is that thing in the sky that I never see usually?
What does it feel like to not have the sun on my skin and for it to help with my happiness? I don't know. I know because I'm from Buffalo. But today I am really excited to talk about Teasha because I don't know. When I was listening, I couldn't help as like just a fellow woman and someone who's a little bit of an entrepreneur myself, feel very inspired by I don't know, her ability for everyone who listened to the episode, obviously, like she went to school and then she kind of decided to start something else. She pulled out of school and decided to start a family. And then through that, decided to build her career down the line and then ended up like building a really awesome career in operations and sales and doing some impressive things before she took on this role to be a founder. And I feel like not always, but a lot of times you hear these crazy success stories of people who are right out of college or they're like they're fresh entrepreneurs. It's the first thing that they're doing. So it was really cool to see someone kind of go through a more quote unquote regular career at first and then find something that she was really passionate about and dive into it. It kind of reminds me of like Bobby Pinero as well, how he
Yeah.
decided to stay at Intercom for so long until he found something he's really passionate about. So this was like a very fun episode for me to listen to.
Yeah, and actually both those situations, but I'll talk about Teasha. I think there are pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages to waiting or not waiting until later in your career. I mean, for her, the advantages are obvious, right? She understands industries, she understands how to operate, she understands how to lead, she can execute and all these things. But then again, she also has a family and responsibilities and
Yep.
the feeling of the risk it takes to step away from something that's predictable and safe. Then jumping into the deep end of entrepreneurship is a real trade off. So whenever I see it happen, I'm like, kudos to you. I mean, it's not easy no matter when you start it, but certainly there are big disadvantages of waiting until you have all this responsibility and a way of life that you're comfortable with to jump into something that is unknown.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. And also speaking of unknown, like that's what switching into this venture scalable company was like for her and most founders as well. Like she had a lot of knowledge on a certain subject, had helped a ton of companies in certain areas of the business, and kind of started to have thoughts dwelling around a certain product. And she was kind of in this internal battle of
Do I keep this a consultancy model? Do I build this into a scalable product? Ended up realizing the amount of stuff she had to build in order to even get this product started. She realized she wanted to go down this path. And she kind of, as I think a lot of people do, just was like, let's do it. Let's jump into this world. Let's go for it. And as she mentioned in the episode, like she ended up getting asked a lot of questions. And when questions would pop up more than once, she said herself, she would be like, all right, now I need to go understand this. And I kind of wanted to pause there because I feel like this is something that pops up in our community a lot, even with like questions and
Yeah.
how to deal with those. And I kind of wanted to give you a chance to share one of your favorite methods for answering questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touch on a couple things before I even get to the questions that come up. But it's
Mm.
like the advantage she has of having been a consultant in a very specific area for a long time means that she deeply understands the space. And like, I think investors, when they back founders and they back really really early stage companies, one of the biggest risks they always think about is whether or not the problem has been validated. Is like, is this an actual problem that people have that they want to pay for a solution? um, and I think that is one of the key advantages of having worked so long in a space, is that you have a lot more conviction of what you want to build. I
Mhm.
think the downside is like, you go so long and you're like, man, does it even make sense to give this up to like go raise money? But yeah, in terms of what she did, going through her initial pitches with investors and collecting the questions that she was being asked, I think you're referring to the thing I tell most founders, which is like, there aren't that many difficult questions or unique questions that you might get when you're going to go pitch your company. I usually think it's like 80% of difficult questions that you'll ever get come out of the first, call it like 5 pitches you ever do.
Yeah.
And by like pitch 8, 9, 10, I think you've covered like 98% of all the hard paths to go down when it comes to Q&A from investors. And what I always recommend is something, super in line with what Teasha was doing, which is like, you're going to go through these questions, you're going to go through these pitches, and you're going to receive these things that are a little bit challenging to answer. And live in the pitch, you're going to do your best to answer it. But the thing you'd absolutely do is, when you're done with that pitch and there's been a net new question lobbed your way, you're going to go back, you're going to think more deeply about the answer to that question, and then you're going to create one standalone slide that answers that question or gives a lot of context for how you might answer that question, and it's going to be in your appendix. So by the time you get this question again, you're going to have the most amazing answer, which is, I love that question. It's a great question. Hold on one second. Go into the appendix and be like, I want to send this very Kamala Harris texting me in the middle of don't worry, I get the messages from both sides. No, but the thing that you will do is you'll be able to reference a slide in your appendix and say, I'd love to bring up this slide, bring it up, and then answer the question extremely thoughtfully. It does a few things. One, it shows this investor, oh my gosh, like this founder is super on top of it to have thought about every single answer, when we just both know, or I already told you, it's not that crazy because there aren't that many unique questions that you might receive. But then two, it kind of shows the investor, oh, like they've been around. There are a lot of people asking questions. There are a lot of investors looking at this deal. It's just a great signal and a great feeling for when you can refer to a slide that answers a question. So I love the way Teasha approached it and the way what she shared in her own process.
Yeah, yeah, and that was exactly what I love. That type of, I love anything that can show that you've thought through something before and that there's also other eyes on you and what you're doing, so I think that's perfect. Something else that came up as I was listening in on this episode was, she ended up going through 2 accelerators. I think the first one was AWS, and then the second was Techstars. And as I don't know why this question came up, but in my head, I was just wondering if accelerators, are they kind of a way to almost be ingrained in your heat building process? I was wondering in my head, like, oh, why does someone want to do like 2 accelerators? Maybe they do 3, maybe they do 4. Who knows how many you could do? But I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that because I really haven't dove into the world of accelerators yet.
Yeah. It's a good question and a good topic, especially for me because I'm someone that has kind of flip flopped in my feelings about accelerator programs. Just to give you a bit of a backstory, I was a venture capitalist. We looked at deals inside and outside of accelerator firms. I remember doing a couple that were actually quite successful. And then when I became a founder myself and I went to go raise capital, my thought was like, I remember we were being encouraged to apply for Y Combinator, and we had a lot of relationships there. We understood the process. We understood what we were going to do. And I just remember being like, accelerators are really only about helping people raise capital. And as you might imagine, I was quite confident in my ability to raise capital. So I was like, well, don't know if I need to pay that exorbitant price in order to get help doing something I'm already good at. So a few things to clarify there. When I say an exorbitant price, I mean standard terms for accelerator programs nowadays range around like essentially writing a check for a valuation somewhere between 1.5 and $4 million, give or take. I mean, the market moves a little bit. And that can be expensive when you think that you could actually raise capital between $5 and $10 million for your pre-seed round. So it can be expensive if you think you're good at raising capital. And it is true. And one of your questions, and it is true that accelerators, one of the big value adds, in my opinion, is that they help the founder create calendar density during a fundraise. They bring a lot of eyeballs all at once
Yep.
to companies right around their demo day. So essentially, they have relationships with investors and they say, by the way, we did this curation process of finding great founders and then also helping guide them through initial parts of making their company better. And we're all going to look at these companies together at demo day. That is in so many words, calendar density. They are setting that up for founders. And if any founder has tried to create calendar density on their own, they know that you can definitely do it on your own, but it takes a ton of work, right? It
Yep.
takes a ton of work and it takes some network. It takes a lot of things that founders might not have, time being one of them, right? So in that sense, I think it's a huge value add. And if you don't think you have the network ability, time, et cetera, to create calendar density, that is one way to get the support to, drive a great fundraise. But the
Yep.
second thing that I underestimated for accelerators is that with the right accelerators, with the right experience and the right people around the table guiding their companies and who are going through the program, I think the accountability and the structure and the pushing of companies to like really make regimented progress while going through the program is quite worth it. If you've never been a founder before, if you thrive with a little bit of guidance and a little bit of coaching, pushing, accelerator programs can be extremely worth it, even outside of the whole fundraising thing. Actually, as I look back on my last company, we were able to raise capital, without an accelerator program, but we were all first-time founders, and I think first-time founders need as much support as possible. And
Yep.
getting support via accelerator programs is not a bad way to do it.
Yeah, it was cool to see, and I was curious as I was listening. What ended up happening, as everyone has heard, is that she was in the middle of the TechStars, going through the TechStars accelerator, and that's how she got or during that, Alabama Futures Fund ended up reaching out to her. I wish I asked you to ask her
Mhm.
where that lead came from because I'm so curious in my head of was it part of the accelerator? Did they find her on LinkedIn? Did she write a nice piece? What did that happen? But anyways, even besides that, I found it super interesting that they ended up being super interested. Techstars wrapped up, ended up getting a term sheet from Alabama's Futures Fund a few weeks after Techstars. And then it still took 6 months and 30 more conversations with investors in order to close that round fully. And that is so a lot of times I think people underestimate like that is a part of the process. Like even after you get 2 yeses, 3 yeses, sometimes it might still take time in order to close up that round. But I was wondering like why what are the top reasons do you think those things happen? Is it because maybe a fund only has a little bit of capital left that they can put towards something and they're more hesitant? Or I just was like, dang, 6 months, a long time.
Yeah, I mean, there are a variety of reasons why rounds can take a really long time. I think it can be summarized in a very like overly simplistic way, but when rounds take a long time, it usually means that not enough funds have enough comfort around the founder and the deal.
Mhm.
And so the reason it takes so long is that they might meet Teasha and CModel for the first time as, Alabama Future Funds is confirming their first check. But they might not feel enough momentum and, like sort of comfort in the deal to just jump in right away. So they meet them and they're like, okay, well, this is cool. We like her. We like some of these things, but we would like to learn more about the company. And
Yep.
it might be the case that they just keep kind of learning more and stay interested enough to be engaged in the deal. And it takes a few more interested parties coming to the table, talking to them. It might take another announcement of some sort of progress within the company, a milestone within revenue or customers, et cetera, to finally get a couple more over the line before you start feeling this this momentum towards closing, in which case it finally does wrap up. And yeah, I think it can be annoying for people from different backgrounds, sort of underrepresented founders, to note that these processes a lot of times take longer in female founders of different backgrounds, because there has been less exposure to founders that look like them or sound like them, et cetera. And that can be an annoying reality to hear about, but it is something that I would just rather founders prepare for rather than complain about, because these expectations of who a great founder is are set in a certain historical pattern that are changing right now. They are evolving, but it hasn't fully been, corrected. And so founders like Teasha will run into these things, but as she showed, if you keep at it, keep pushing the company forward and continue building these relationships, it might take 6 months, but it gets done.
That is a beautiful way to end the debrief. I love that.
Is that the debrief?
That's the debrief.
If you're looking for more insights, strategies, and support around fundraising, subscribe to our newsletter. It's at fundedpod.com/newsletter. And find me on social. I'm at Jayeh, that's JAYYEH, on almost every platform. I respond to DMs and newsletter replies, so hit me up. This episode was produced by Paige Randall.
Hey guys.
Thanks also to John O'Lee from Adamant.
Hey everyone.
And as always, one last thanks to our sponsor, Vanta, the leading automated security and compliance platform.